Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. This is Janet from the College of Coastal Georgia. I'm actually broadcasting from the University of Georgia Marine Institute on Sapelo Island, where my husband and I have holed up to social distance ourselves. He's out here. His field course was canceled. He was teaching a field course out here. Well, actually, it's gone online as well. So we thought this might be a good place to stay and be away from each other. I hope you are all well. Hope you're all healthy. And I hope you're socially distancing yourself. So I want to talk a little bit first about how you can reach me should you need to reach me. Go ahead and send me an email via D2L, all right? I check those several times a day, so please go ahead and do that if you have questions. I'll also be looking at ways we can set up a chat room for each one of these lectures, should we need to have a discussion or anything like that. All right. In addition to watching this video, we are covering marine ecology, and this is chapter 9 of your textbook. So hopefully you've gone back to school and gotten your textbooks, or you are going back to do that. So get chapter 9 and go ahead and read it to go along with this, all right? Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. It's been quite a while since we had a lecture. It's been quite a while since we talked about oceanography. So I think we need to do a little bit of review, especially about marine ecology. So let me remind you that marine ecology in general, in fact, is the study of interrelationships between both the physical and the biological aspects of the environment. All right, so quite often the physical aspects of the environment, such as temperature or chemistry or things like currents or wind or anything like that, those very often affect the biological aspects of the environment. But biological aspects also affect the physical aspects. You can have situations where the living parts of an ecosystem influence the physical parts. So keep that in mind. It's a two-way street, all right? It's also the study of how organisms adapt to and alter their environment. A great example of that would be something like in altering their environment. The salt marshes that we have here in Georgia, they alter their environment. They build themselves. They build themselves up. And so they're altering their environment. Coral reefs do that as well. All sorts of things do that. One of the things we talked about before spring break, which was a long time ago now, was the way that we start to think about organisms, how we classify them, how we put them into groups. And one of those ways is we put them into groups based on what they're related to. So closely related groups go into, closely related organisms go into groups together. And one of the ways that we group them is into kingdoms. These are big, broad groups of organisms. There are 5 of them. And we talked a little bit about them before we left. So the first one is Monera, and these would be the bacteria, and this includes the cyanobacteria, such as the blue-green algae. Blue-green algae are often the cause of harmful algal blooms, or if you've heard of red tide, well, red tide is actually caused by a dinoflagellate, but there are other things like red tide, which we call harmful algal blooms, and those are quite commonly caused by blue-green algae. So that's the first group. The next group would be the protists, and these are single-celled organisms. They have a nucleus. Now, bacteria do not have a nucleus. Their DNA is not captured within a nucleus. Protists are single-celled organisms, and they have a nucleus. So their DNA is organized within a structure inside the cell called the nucleus. So here we have a coccolithophore. We've seen these guys before. They're shelled algae, and remember that there are a lot of these, and when they die, those shells go down to the bottom. They become marine sediment, and they eventually become limestone, right? So these are coccolithophores. We also have fungi, the fungus, right? These in the ocean are particularly abundant in the intertidal zone. They're really important for decomposition. We have they're kind of hard to see because quite often they look just like slime. So these are cultures of them that are on Petri dishes. Okay, now we have the chromista, and these would be the plants, things like seagrass, things like kelps and seaweed. And here we have this top picture is a diatom. These are particularly important in temperate waters, such as up near New England, near Europe, up near Japan, down near Antarctica. And then here, this guy right here is a dinoflagellate, and these are more common in warmer waters, such as down near Florida. So tropical waters, you'd find a lot of diatoms rather than, or dinoflagellates, sorry, rather than diatoms. Our final group are the metazoa. We're metazoa. This is the same thing as Animalia. Okay, so these are big multicellular animals that include things like the whales, the fish, the crabs, anything like that that's multicellular. Okay, so we are part of that metazoa group. So that's one way you can organize, one way that you can classify organisms is into groups that are related to one another because of their common descent, because of evolution, basically. These all evolved from a common ancestor. So the bacteria have a common ancestor, the protists have a common ancestor, the fungi do, the chromista do, and then the animalia do. Another way that you can organize living things is by their lifestyle. So where they live, how they live, things like that. And three broad categories for this would be the plankton, the nekton, and the benthic organisms. We've talked about these before. So plankton, we can put them into two broad groups, the phytoplankton. So these are diatoms here. So these would be phytoplankton. They get their energy from the sun. And then these guys are copepods. They're zooplankton. They get their energy by eating phytoplankton. So this is the bottom of the food chain. This is the next step up. And copepods are one of the most important organisms in the ocean because so many animals eat them. So we're talking about bottom of the food chain, next step up, and then steps above that would be fish. Steps above that would be things like whales, bigger fish, or even us. So these are plankton. They can swim, but, well, zooplankton can swim. Phytoplankton just drift around. Zooplankton can swim, but they swim very, very slowly. They're not strong swimmers, so they really can't fight a current. So both of these types of organisms, plankton, are subject to the current. They go where the current takes them, all right? So that's what we consider the plankton. Now, the nekton would be things that can swim independent of currents. So here we have a basking shark, one of my favorite guys. He actually, this organism here, basking sharks, directly eat zooplankton. So they're the second largest fish in the world, and they get so big by eating zooplankton. So they can swim against the current, so they can pretty much choose where they want to go. So these are called the nekton. And then we have benthic organisms. These are organisms that live down on the bottom, such as this rock crab. Some organisms live in the bottom. They burrow down into the sand or the mud, and those are called infauna. And this guy lives on top of the bottom, so he's considered epifauna. All right, so different ways to live. So we can organize living things based on the ways that they make their living. We should note that a lot of organisms go between lifestyles and habitats. We talked about this right before spring break. We talked about barnacles. So barnacles are glued down. Here they are. They glue down. They have these little legs that they take. They look like feathers. They're called cirri, which means feather. And they take these out and they sweep the current with them. They sweep the water with them to catch plankton. So they're filter feeders. They release their larvae up into the water column. And these, so here they're benthic, and now their babies are planktonic. And they go through several stages of being a planktonic organism until they get big enough to where they're ready to settle. And when they do that, they look like this. They look for the proper place to settle. They settle and they become benthic again. So barnacles start out as benthic as adults, are planktonic, and then become a benthic again. All right. Now, if you missed the Friday before spring break, you missed our discussion of how barnacles actually mate. If you're glued down in one place, how are you going to find love? It's hard to find love when you're glued down far away from your friends. So barnacles have this thing called the groping penis. I know, you didn't think you'd hear this, did you? It is actually the longest penis compared to body size of any organism in the world. It's several times the size of their body. And it allows them to reach out to other organisms around them, so it doesn't matter if they're glued down. All right, so sorry you missed that discussion. We saw some pretty racy videos right before spring break. So that PowerPoint is on D2L. If you missed that, you probably want to watch it because I might have some questions on the test about that. Some other organisms that go through that change their lifestyle between planktonic or benthic. Jellyfish quite often do that. Now, the common nomenclature for this type of organism is jellyfish, but if you're a biologist, you just call it a jelly. All right, jellies quite often go between being benthic and planktonic, and then blue crabs as well. Blue crabs, when they're adults, they're benthic, but they release their babies just like barnacles do up into the plankton. And those plankton eventually settle and find just the place they want to be. Now, if you're going to release your babies like this, if you're going to disperse your larvae, there's a lot of great things that can happen because of that, because you can disperse, a species can be dispersed that way, so you can find new habitats where the species can continue. But you also need to be real careful about how that happens. So often larval dispersal, adults will disperse their larvae, they'll release their larvae at times of the year when there's a lot of plankton, a lot of phytoplankton. So that's the great thing about being a planktonic larvae. You can get up into the water column and you can eat those phytoplankton or those zooplankton. You can capture other zooplankton, all right? So that's another great thing about starting your life as part of the plankton. Let's look at some of examples of this. So this is a polychaete worm here. They're benthic, and people call them things like clam worms. They're pretty common in mud habitats. And this is what the planktonic larvae looks like for this adult. You can see he's starting to develop. You can see this guy has lots of segments, and here are his segments. He's starting to segment as well. This guy has all these feet. These are bristly feet. In fact, some people call these bristleworms. In fact, polychaete, his name polychaete means many-footed, and he's starting to get his bristles here. So he's starting to get his feet. All right. So that's one example of larval dispersal. We have, this is one of my favorites. So this is the blue crab. We talked about it just a little bit earlier. So this is the adult. They're delicious. They're one of my favorite foods. They're very, very, they have these very, very nasty claws on them. I did some research on these about 20 years ago. I helped with a research project, and one of them got a hold of me once, and man, it would not feel very good. So this is what the females look like when they are gravid. Gravid means it's kind of the same as pregnant. She's carrying eggs. They often call this buried. These are her berries. So she has this flap underneath her. She carries her eggs in there, and she has thousands and thousands of eggs here. This is one of the things that when you have this lifestyle where you're going from the benthos to the plankton, you need to release a lot of babies because you don't know how many of them are going to survive. You're not really giving them any help surviving, so your strategy is to just have a whole bunch of them out there, right? So she's going to release thousands upon thousands of planktonic larvae. When she releases them, this is what they look like here. This is called a zoea, right? This is one of my very favorite plankton because he's got this unicorn horn and he's got this, I don't know, big long nose, right? So this is a zoea. This is the first stage of blue crab larvae. And this will molt several times and still look like this, but eventually it will molt and it will look like this. And this is called a megalops, all right? And this megalops is bigger than the zoea, so it looks different and it's bigger. It will eventually start to lose this little tail and look more, so it will molt several times again. It will lose this little tail and it will start to look more and more like a blue crab. Eventually, it will just be a very small blue crab, about the width of 2 dimes put together, 2 or 3 dimes put together, and that's when it's time for this guy to settle, all right, and become part of the benthos again. Here's something that if you've walked around the beaches on St. Simon, you've probably seen these, right? So what are these? These are called egg collars, and they come from moon snails. These are great big predatory snails. These guys have a rasping tongue. If you know what a rasp is, like from shop, it's kind of like a long metal knife, except that the whole side of it is very, very rough. So you can smooth things out using a rasp. He has a tongue just like that, and he will drill down into other snails or clams or anything like that. So he's predatory, and this is how they lay their eggs. They have these egg collars. They actually build it around themselves, and then they walk out of it. So this is full of eggs, and it will eventually release all these little planktonic larvae. These are called veligers, and these will molt several times. They'll develop. Actually, I shouldn't say they will molt. They will develop into a very small snail. These will get smaller. The snail parts will get larger, and then it will settle. And then finally, this is a sea urchin. Sea urchins are really interesting developmentally, and we're going to take a look and see what this looks like when they release their larvae.
Is this a landscape from science fiction? We are at the surface of a sea urchin. A slow-moving animal grazing on algae-covered rocks. Few people know that urchins go through a graceful larval stage. The Pluteus, barely visible to the naked eye, drift with other planktonic creatures and are a favorite food for fish, shrimps, and crustaceans. Sea urchins are champions when it comes to producing large numbers of embryos. They release millions of eggs and billions of spermatozoids in the open sea, generally during full moon or just before a storm. Fertilization in the open sea gives rise to large populations of embryos developing in perfect synchrony. No wonder sea urchins have been used in laboratory research for more than a century. In a single day, the egg becomes a blastula, a ball of cells covered with cilia. Soon the ball hollows out, forming the gut of a gastrula. A mouth opens. The embryo starts feeding and turns into a Pluteus larvae. A skeleton made of calcium carbonate crystals forms delicate, iridescent spicules. Using bands of ciliated cells, the week-old Pluteus moves around, creating currents that direct algae and small particles to its mouth. A baby urchin grows inside the Pluteus. The baby soon outgrows and digests its mother. This metamorphosis frees the young urchin on its journey.
Okay, so that's a good review of how organisms use larvae to disperse. There are some other examples of this in your book, and I hope you'll take a look and read those. So now if you're going to release larvae, that's great because they can take advantage of phytoplankton. It's a great way to feed when you're really little. It also allows you to find new habitat. But how do larvae know they're settling in a good place? That's one of the risks of this. You might release all of your babies up into the water column, and currents might take them far away from what would be a good place to settle. For example, if you're a clam or an oyster, something like that, you need to settle in the right place. An oyster, for example, needs to settle on something hard, all right? A barnacle needs to settle on something hard. If you're a barnacle and you settle on mud, there's nothing to glue yourself down with, right? So you need to find a good place to settle if you're a larvae, all right? Now, young larvae are phototactic. They're drawn to light. This keeps them, they can't swim strongly, but they can keep themselves up near the top of the water column, so they can kind of tread water up there at the top. That's a great place to be because there's lots of phytoplankton up there, right? So young larvae are drawn to light. That keeps them up near the top of the water column, all right? When larvae are ready to settle, when they get big enough and they've gone through enough life stages to settle, they don't just settle any place. This was a real revelation to scientists who sort of assumed that, plankton were just subject to the currents, and wherever the currents took them when they got big enough, that's where they would be. But that's not the case for larvae. Larvae can actually make some choices about where they're going to settle. Right? They don't just settle any place. They're looking for the proper habitat.